Hello and welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Stuti Goswami. Now the module that we are going to do is module number 20, and the title is Women Only or Women-Led Peace Movements. Now it is often mistaken that, or rather it is often a misconception that women's movements are homogeneous. But we have to understand that women from different parts of the world have different ideologies, they have different political affiliations, they have different ethnic, economic and religious affiliations, and most importantly, they have different cultural, historical, societal and political experiences. And yet, in spite of all differences, all kinds of differences, women across all these barriers have reached out to one another in times of need. Women play important role not simply in women-only led organizations, but also in those organizations where both men and women are equal participants. One example of this would be MAVO, or Mobilization Against War and Oppression, where 3 women, Janine Solanki, Azhar Rojbi and Alice Bodine, hold key positions. In Women, War and Peace, the independent experts' assessment of the impact of armed conflict on women and women's role in peace building, Elizabeth Wren and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf have spoken about or written about how women have sacrificed their lives for peace, how they have challenged militarism, and how they have opposed the development, testing and proliferation of nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, as well as the small arms trade. Women have also contributed significantly to peace building as activists, as community leaders and as survivors of war. But the sad truth is that their efforts are rarely supported or rewarded. In fact, one must also remember that women have not only led peace movements, but they have played an extremely important role in their day-to-day lives by resisting war. Women do this by constantly rebuilding institutions like schools and health centers, which are at the very core of any civilized society, and also by forming groups to provide food, medicine and clothes to those in need. These activities are often overlooked or ignored, and thus women's role in peace efforts, whenever it is discussed, always tend to focus on other activities like negotiations or combat. It is also a fact that women-only organizations facilitate a free and frank exchange of ideas, wherein women who are sufferers of various kinds of violence pertaining to conflict can speak about their experiences unhindered. Also, such organizations provide a platform or a space to women to express themselves and build a rapport or a bond with other women. This is particularly true of women who have experienced rape and such other forms of sexual violence during armed conflicts. The ability to tell their stories heals women and also helps other women recognize the importance of peace. In fact, the very fact that women sufferers can express, can articulate their sufferings is a kind of verbal therapy. There have been various innovative approaches like the Women Talk Peace approach, In fact, the Women Talk Peace is actually a series of radio productions that endeavor to increase awareness about the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and address the impact that war has on women and women's contribution to conflict resolution and sustainable peace. Now, this endeavor was initiated by the International Women's Tribune Center, or IWTC. We also have to understand that in their various endeavors, women are redefining peace. And we will now have a look at some women-led peace movements that have played an important role in this direction. Firstly, in April 1915, almost a year after the First World War broke out, more than 1,000 and 1,100 women from both warring and neutral states gathered at The Hague in April 1915, as has been mentioned already. Now, these women were neither diplomats nor politicians, and most of them did not even have the right to vote. But these women were feminists and pacifists, and these two values and ideals were at the very core of the efforts that this congregation made in order to find a solution to the conflict that raged across Europe at the time. It is significant that these women who gathered were mainly middle-class women, and mostly they were from professional backgrounds. They were educated, traveled, experienced feminist activists. Some of the important women activists who were part of this congregation were Aletta Jacobs, the pioneering Dutch physician, Rosika Swimmer, the Hungarian feminist, and Crystal Macmillan, the British lawyer. The US peace campaigner Jane Addams agreed to preside as the chairperson of this Congress. Now, this congregation or this Congress had debates and discussions across 4 days. And eventually, a set of 20 resolutions were drafted. Now, these resolutions offered proposals for immediate negotiations to end the war, and also they laid down certain fundamental principles for permanent peace. However, it is important to mention in this context that all delegates who wished to attend this Congress from the outset or at the very beginning had to pledge their support for women's suffrage. This is so because the Congress's organizers saw that the right to vote for women could not be separated from the objective of attaining peace. A just world free of conflict, as they argued, was impossible to be achieved unless women were allowed to take their rightful places alongside men as equal citizens. In the year 1968, in the month of January, the Jeanette Rankin Brigade was formed. Now, this brigade was named after Jeanette Rankin, who was a famous feminist and peace activist from the United States of America, and she was also the first woman to be elected to the US Congress in 1917. Of course, it is another thing that she voted against US involvement in both the First World War and the Second World War. This brigade that was formed in 1968 was formed by a coalition of women's groups who got together to show women's solidarity against the Vietnam War. A peace march was organized to Washington on the 15th of January 1968 to confront Congress on its opening day. However, there were a group of younger feminists like Shulamith Firestone who criticized such efforts. They felt, these younger women felt that the Women's Peace March would not be ultimately successful because women were not being politically visible. Women were rather being passive reactors to the actions of men instead of organizing as women to change that definition of femininity, as Firestone said. Of course, many of the senior women did not agree with the younger feminists, though eventually the young brigade succeeded in asserting themselves, asserting their point, breaking away from gendered stereotypes and claiming a space of their own. Secondly, we look at women's peace movements in Israel. Now, the character of women's peace movements in Israel is entirely different from other peace movements across the world. One big reason for this is the complex relation that exists between Israelis and Palestinians. The feminist peace movement in Israel is different from others also because these feminists work together with and for Palestinian women. There is this coalition of Women for Peace that has played a stellar role in peacemaking activities in Israel. Now, this coalition is actually a framework. It is not an organization, but a framework that comprises 10 women's peace organizations that together work in achieving peace in Israel. Women of the Women in Black movement, for example, dressed in black and held placards saying "End the occupation," and they have been holding vigils every Friday for 20 long years. Again, activists of new profile work towards ending militarization of Israeli society. These activists of this organization support and persuade both men and women not to take part in army duty in the occupied territories. There is another organization called the Checkpoint Watch or the Maxim Watch that keeps an eye on and documents checkpoints where Israeli soldiers block the movement of Palestinians. This organization or the activists of this organization do so in order to bring the brutality of the Israeli soldiers and humiliation of the Palestinian civilians into focus. Another organization called the Bats Shalom organization works jointly with Palestinian women to build peace. Now, in view of the complex relation that exists between Israelis and Palestinians, the strategies of the Israeli feminist peace movement have been extremely varied. Apart from holding demonstrations and vigils, they have also, firstly, organized humanitarian aid as a political statement by helping Palestinian families. Secondly, they have staged street plays and organized bus tours of the occupied territories in order to make ordinary Israelis aware of the atrocities of the Israeli army on the Palestinians. Thirdly, and very significantly, they have used the internet to mobilize local and international public opinion. Fourthly, they have blocked bulldozers, chained themselves to olive trees and faced and opposed soldiers who attempted to destroy and demolish Palestinian homes and property. Fifthly, they have worked jointly with Palestinian women to prevent construction of the separation wall. These are some of the more significant of the activities that have been undertaken by the Israeli women's peace movements. A very important a veteran organization of this coalition of women for peace is Women in Black. Now, this movement actually began in the year 1988 in the month of January, exactly or about a month after the first Palestinian Intifada broke out. A small group of Israeli women carried out a very simple form of protest that quickly caught the attention of the international community. What these women did was this. Once a week at the same hour and in the same location, and that was a major traffic intersection, these women wore black clothing and raised a black sign in the shape of a hand with white lettering that read, "Stop the occupation." Of course, this movement spread all over the world and it became an international organization, and today women in different parts of the world dress themselves in black in order to and raise placards in order to protest against atrocities and exploitations of different sorts in their respective regions. In all, Women in Black vigils across the world, by dressing in black, these women try to highlight and uphold and lay focus on the tragedy of victims of violence. It is also significant to note here that Women in Black is more than an organization. It is a worldwide network of women committed to peace and actively opposed to injustice, war, militarism, and any form of violence. The next is Code Pink. Now, Code Pink is a women-led grassroots organization working to end United States of America's wars and militarism. It supports peace and human rights initiatives and urges the US government to channel its resources into more important sectors like healthcare, education, green jobs, and so on. This organization was formed by a group of women who opposed the entry of US forces in Iraq. However, it is important and very interesting to mention at this juncture that the tactics of members of Code Pink, or Code Pinkers as they call themselves, are wide-ranged, and they include satire, street theatre, creative visuals, civil resistance, and they directly challenge powerful decision makers in the governments and corporations. And of course, all the women wear pink. Some of the important Pink action principles, that means some of the important principles of Code Pink, are as follows: non-violence, because they believe that peaceful means of protest and resolving conflict is highly effective in coalition work. Secondly, they have clear goals. Now, they define themselves, Code Pink defines itself as having created a unique niche in the community through creative protests, by cultivating women's voices, through street theatres, and so on. Responsibility and teamwork. This organization works in teams, sharing tasks and responsibilities and building skills together. In this way, basically, they seek to generate and develop unity among the women. Diversity and tolerance, which is again very, very significant in the present context, in the context of the present times. Now, these women members of Code Pink embrace feminist principles of cooperation, problem solving, critical thinking, compassion analysis, and processing. They raise their voice against racism of any sort, against homophobia, against sexism, against ageism, and so on. Next is resource sharing, messaging. Another of the principles is messaging, and very interestingly and importantly, global community. Code Pink's efforts at ending the war in Iraq was shared by 250 local groups in the United States of America and a dozen international groups. The solidarity that was demonstrated between Code Pinkers in the US and overseas strengthened their efforts and their desire and belief that war and warlike situations engaged in by the United States military could be ended for sure. Next is Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence, the Okinawa Islands and Ryukyu Islands of Japan. We have to understand that women do not simply want a cessation of violence. What they look for establishing is ending or cessation or lessening of militarization, because the culture of sexual and gender-based violence in patriarchal societies is reinforced by the long-term presence of armed forces, whether state or private, and by militarization. Women's organizations recognize that militarization and conflict destroys social cohesion and breaks trust within community, and most importantly, alienates people from the state. The breakdown of the community increases the risk or the vulnerability factor of women. Now, in Okinawa, what happened was, during the Second World War, in the year 1945, the Battle of Okinawa took place. Now, in this battle, or as a consequence of this battle, the civilian population was one of the worst affected during the Second World War. Military violence against women began during this Battle of Okinawa, and it increased after it ended. Countless women were raped. In fact, there are probably no proper records of how many women were raped and killed during this whole phase. And also what happened was huge military bases were set up in Okinawa. The Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence was established in the year 1995 on the 8th of November. Now this was established with the objective of achieving true security for women and children, to oppose military violence and to seek the withdrawal of US military presence from Okinawa. However, the starting point of the formation of this organization was the rape of a 12-year-old girl, Okinawan girl, by 3 US military personnel on September 4, 1995. Now, ironically, this rape occurred during the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, in which 71 Okinawan women had also participated and held a workshop on the theme Military Violence Against Women to document 50 years of military violence endured by the Okinawan island due to the military bases. Some of the activities and endeavors of this organization include: firstly, compiling a chronology of post-war crimes of military violence against women. Secondly, holding a 12-day sit-in, silent processions in memory of women victims of military violence throughout the 53 post-war years. Thirdly, building memorials to the suffering of women who were made military sexual slaves, and there is a term for this, comfort women. So memorials were built, or they endeavored to build memorials in honor of comfort women who suffered during the Second World War. The next point is petitioning the Japanese government and carrying out nationwide signature campaigns in order to generate public opinion. Next, this organization also raised the issue at the international level, and they sought to appeal directly to the American people, which resulted in 2 peace caravans being formed that created strong ties with Okinawa peace networks in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the United States. The Women's Regional Network. Now, the Women's Regional Network, or WRN, was formed in 2011. This network comprises women civil society leaders from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And together, this organization and members of this organization work towards raising voice for women's rights and security. In WRN, women collaborate, cutting across borders, and listen to each other's experiences and thereby try to gain insight and learn from each other's experiences. WRN is committed to working for women's rights and for equitable and sustainable development of women. They also seek to ensure that women are full participants in any peace-building organization and any peace-building exercise. Some of the WRN's core values are as follows. Firstly, they honor the collective vision of the alliance of women from different countries, 3 different countries, and believe in the importance of a shared mission. Secondly, they ensure that women and women's issues are an integral part of policy discussion at all levels. Thirdly, this organization is committed to working as part of a regional movement and a global movement to build a collective voice and to develop and effect collective influence. Next, and very significantly, this organization works independently of any political party, government, or religious institution. This actually gives the WRN a lot of freedom to raise its voice and to express its opinions and make its efforts. Support appropriate strategies to ensure each participant's personal security is safeguarded. Next, and very importantly, identify and resist militarization of civilian authority or civilian institutions and development aid. So these are some of the core values of the WRN. Of course, these are just a few of a number of peace movements that are being led by women in different parts of the world. The methods of these different peace movements might be different, but they share a common goal in fighting for peace and this has been happening from the ancient times till the present times. For example, we may cite the global network of peace builders that has more than 85 organizations that are its members. These organizations represent all the continents and are together committed to peace. We have basically, I believe this module has given a basic idea of some very, very important and significant women-only led peace movements that have played a very, very crucial role in establishing peace in the world, or at least in making efforts in those directions. Before we wind up, we need to throw a glimpse at the difference between women-only and mixed gender-led movements. Now, the difference between women-only and mixed gender-led movements can be understood with the following example. In the year 1934, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, a peace pledge union was initiated with a letter written by Richard Laurie Shepard, published in the Guardian and other newspapers. The date of publication of this letter was 16th October 1934. Now, this letter, and in this letter written by Richard Laurie Shepard, the writer called out to men and only to men to send him postcards pledging never to support war. And the response was unprecedented because a large number of men sent Shepard their postcards pledging never to support war. Now, the appeal to males only was basically to counter the very idea that only women were interested in peace. Of course, 2 years later, in 1936, membership was opened to women, and some women members like Vera Brittain became its influential members. But during the Second World War, soon after the fall of France, the PPU abandoned all calls for peace negotiations and rather focused its attention on supporting food relief campaign and the Central Board for Conscientious Objectors. Thus, the whole effort or the whole movement seemed to fizzle out. Of course, it has a few positive activities also. One very good example would be its support. One of the PPU's more visible activities would be its support for the White Poppy Appeal, which was started in 1933 by the Women's Cooperative Guild to oppose the Royal British Legion's Red Poppy Appeal. Now, the red poppy was used as a symbol to commemorate the British soldiers who died in the First World War. In contrast to this and in opposition to this, the white poppy was used as a symbol to commemorate not only British soldiers killed in the war, but also civilian victims on all sides, because war caused untold destruction and devastation, and losses were suffered not simply by members of one country, but members of all the participating countries, and that is something this effort sought to establish. From our discussion in this module, we can say that whatever efforts have been made all through the years to secure and establish peace in the world are extremely relevant even today. In fact, to say that these efforts and further efforts are the need of the hour would not be an exaggeration. These peace movements, in a way, have shown the way for the future generations to follow in their footsteps in order to ensure that peace is eventually secured in a turbulent world. Thank you.